A black pastor was instructed to take down his cross in midair. Rather than lose his temper, he got up and made a point that nobody could ignore. Rolling a simple black carry-on behind him, Pastor Elijah Rowe entered Raleigh-Durham International Airport via sliding glass doors on a warm Friday morning in late April. He never had been in a rush. Elijah, who was 58, moved with the poise of a man who had discovered that there was no peace in hurrying. Travel 287 would take him through the first leg of his travel to Albuquerque, which was planned to stop in Kansas City. He was dressed in dark pants, a light cream linen shirt, and scuffed brown shoes that had seen more hospital rooms and potluck dinners than he could remember. However, it wasn't his attire that caught the eye. It was the little wooden cross that was softly pressed to his chest. There were no diamonds or gold, and it wasn't gaudy or big. It's simply a piece of carved wood with smooth edges from years of use. It had been handed to him by his grandma just before her death when he was 18. When the world forgets who you are, wear it, she advised him. Since then, he hadn't removed it. Elijah located a peaceful corner seat at gate C21 and took out a notepad. He loved the feel of a pen on paper to a laptop when preparing sermons. The lesson this week focused on forgiveness. Once more, he gave himself a little laugh. He sipped lukewarm coffee from a paper cup and muttered, "It seems like God wants me to keep teaching what I still need to learn." The boarding call was made promptly. He got up, said a kind good morning to the gate agent, and headed down the jet bridge. He nodded slightly to the flight attendant by the door, a tall lady with a clipped tone and rigid stance. Elijah whispered to himself, "Seat 22A," as he proceeded down the aisle. There was already a young man sitting in 22B with his hood up and headphones on. Elijah gave him a polite smile and sat down by the window. The boy barely looked up. That was fine. Elijah never needed conversation to feel comfortable. He rested the cross against his shirt and resumed writing in his notebook. 15 minutes later, the cabin door closed. The aircraft pulled away from the gate. The usual announcements played, followed by the clunky roll down the runway. Elijah whispered a quiet prayer as the plane lifted into the sky. He was halfway through his outline on Luke 6 when a voice interrupted him. "Sir," a woman's voice said from the aisle. "Sir, excuse me." Elijah looked up to see the same tall flight attendant from earlier standing beside him. "Yes, ma'am," he asked, eyes kind. She didn't smile. "Can I ask you to tuck your necklace into your shirt, please?" Elijah blinked. "My cross." She nodded. "We've had a few complaints." He looked around, surprised. "From who?" "I can't disclose that," she said quickly. "We just ask passengers to be mindful of displays that might make others uncomfortable." He studied her face for a moment. There was no warmth in it, no room for discussion. "I'm sorry," Elijah said slowly, "but this necklace isn't a display. It's my faith. It was my grandmother's." "Sir, I'm not trying to argue with you," she said, her voice tightening. "I'm asking you to please comply with a simple request so we can avoid any further issues." "Is this an airline policy?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "I need you to cooperate." The young man in 22B pulled down his hoodie slightly and glanced at Elijah, then looked away. Elijah's hands remained still on his notebook. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't moved an inch. "I'm sorry," he said again, softer this time, "but I won't be hiding it." The flight attendant exhaled through her nose, clearly annoyed. "I'll be back," she said, then turned and walked away. Elijah sat back in his seat and looked out the window. The clouds were thick below them, pure white, stretching for miles. He touched the cross gently, thumb rubbing the worn edge. This wasn't new. Not exactly. But something about it felt different, like something had shifted, even if he couldn't name it yet. But the flight wasn't over, and neither was the conversation. The drink cart was 2 rows behind when she came back. No smile. No warmth. Just the same stiff posture and that clipped professional tone that made every word feel like a formality, not a conversation. "Sir," she said again, standing over Elijah's row, her arms crossed this time. I need to ask you again to tuck the necklace away. There's a woman 2 rows up who said she finds it offensive. Elijah didn't respond right away. He looked at her. Really looked at her. Her name tag read Densmore. Her uniform was pristine, not a thread out of place. She kept glancing at the other passengers, as if looking for backup or an audience. He glanced forward. Row 20. A woman in a blue blazer with large sunglasses stared straight ahead. Didn't look back. Didn't fidget. Just waited. I understand what you're saying, Elijah replied calmly, but I've done nothing wrong. I haven't spoken to anyone. I've just been sitting here quietly. Why is this necklace a problem? Claire Densmore's jaw tensed. This isn't about you being quiet. This is about you being considerate. If someone feels offended by something you're wearing, it's not unreasonable to ask you to adjust it. Elijah's voice stayed steady. If someone is offended by my faith, I don't believe that gives them the right to silence it. That was when her tone shifted. The mask dropped a little. You're being difficult, she said, louder this time. I'm asking you nicely, but you're being combative. Several heads turned. A woman 2 rows back leaned out into the aisle, watching. A man across from Elijah adjusted his seat to get a better view. Elijah's heart rate picked up, but his face didn't change. He looked to the young man in 22B. The kid had pulled out his phone. Not openly, just slightly, screen tilted up, thumb hovering over the record button. I'm not trying to start anything, Elijah said, speaking slowly, but I won't hide my cross. I won't remove it for someone else's comfort. I'm sorry. Claire didn't like that. Then we may have to escalate this, she said sharply. You're refusing to follow a directive from a flight crew member. That's a federal offense. Someone gasped. Are you serious? Came a voice from a few rows back. A middle-aged man with a salt and pepper beard leaned into the aisle. He's literally just sitting there. Claire ignored him. I'm going to inform the captain, she said, still looking at Elijah. We'll handle this when we land. Of course, Elijah replied. She turned and walked off again, this time briskly, muttering something to another flight attendant as she passed the drink cart. The silence that followed felt thick. Elijah didn't look around. He stayed in his seat, pen still resting between his fingers. The pages of his sermon notes fluttered slightly in the breeze of the overhead vent. Then came a whisper. Sir, the boy next to him murmured, barely audible over the hum of the plane, I'm recording, just so you know. In case they try anything. Elijah turned his head slowly and gave the boy a grateful nod. Thank you, he said quietly. I saw everything, the boy added. She's way out of line. Elijah smiled faintly. Sometimes it's not about the cross. It's about the person wearing it. The boy didn't answer, but he looked down at his phone, still filming. 3 rows back, an older black woman leaned to her companion and whispered something. Her eyes locked with Elijah's for a brief second. She gave him a slight gesture, like she saw him, and she understood. That meant something. The intercom dinged. Another attendant, not Claire, made a quick announcement about light turbulence ahead. Routine, but the energy on the plane had shifted. People weren't just trying to nap or watch movies anymore. They were paying attention. It wasn't the kind of attention Elijah wanted, but it wasn't about him anymore. But before the plane could land, something would happen that no one expected, not even Elijah. By the time the plane leveled out after the turbulence warning, Claire Densmore returned to the aisle. But this time, she wasn't alone. Another flight attendant trailed behind her, a younger man with dark hair and nervous eyes. His name tag read Jonas Worth, and unlike Claire, he didn't walk with confidence. His steps were hesitant, almost apologetic. Mr. Rowe, Claire began, loud enough for half the cabin to hear, I've spoken with the captain. If you continue to disregard crew instructions, we may be required to take further action when we land. Elijah didn't flinch. I'd still like to know what policy I've broken. You're being confrontational again, Claire snapped. Jonas stepped forward, glancing between them. Maybe we could just. Claire cut him off. Jonas, I've got it handled. There it was again, that tension. That tone. Elijah remained seated, calm. But inside, his heart was pounding. Behind them, row 19 stirred. I don't see why he should have to hide his cross, said a woman with curly red hair and a thick Wisconsin accent. I wear a Star of David necklace every flight I take. No one's ever said a word to me. Claire turned sharply. Ma'am, I'm asking you not to interfere. I'm not interfering, the woman replied. I'm just saying this feels like you're singling him out. That was when something shifted visibly. The cabin wasn't just watching now, they were reacting. A man in 18D leaned over. Is this really how this airline treats pastors? Because I'm filming too, and I know how fast things move online. Claire looked startled for a moment. She opened her mouth to speak but then shut it again. Elijah, Jonas said softly, stepping in, lowering his voice. Sir, I'm sorry. I really am. You've been nothing but respectful. I think we should de-escalate. Let's just let it be. Claire's face flushed. She stared at Jonas like he'd betrayed her. Then, with forced control, she hissed. He's ignoring a direct order. To do what? Elijah asked, still composed. To hide a part of myself that I've worn for 40 years. That doesn't sit right with me, ma'am. Claire's jaw tensed again. I'm done. She spun around and stormed toward the front of the plane, her shoulders rigid with anger. Jonas stayed behind, uncertain. I'm sorry about all this, he said quietly to Elijah. Really? I think she misread the situation. I think she read it just fine, Elijah said gently. She just didn't like what she saw. Jonas looked down, then turned away. The cabin settled, but the air was thick with discomfort. Passengers whispered across the aisle, some openly shaking their heads. Someone coughed to break the silence. The boy in 22B was still filming. Then Elijah did something that no one expected. He stood up. He didn't raise his voice, didn't wave his arms. He just stood in the narrow space beside his seat and turned slightly so the rows around him could hear. I don't usually speak in public places like this, he began, his voice steady but low, but I think it's important to say something. Row after row turned their eyes toward him. I'm a pastor, he continued. I serve a small church in Durham. This cross, he lifted it gently between his fingers, was a gift from my grandmother. She lived through things most of us only read about. She told me to wear this when the world tried to tell me who I wasn't. A pause. Silence. I haven't taken it off since her funeral. Not because I think it makes me better, but because it reminds me to stay kind. A woman in 24C covered her mouth. Someone in 20F sniffled. I know not everyone believes what I believe. I respect that. But I've done nothing wrong here. I've sat quietly, I've followed every rule, and I've tried to be gracious, even when I was made to feel small. He looked directly at Jonas. I don't need to be escorted off this flight. I'm not a threat. I'm just a man flying home to preach about forgiveness on Sunday. The plane was quiet, but sometimes silence speaks louder than anything, and the plane wasn't going to stay silent much longer. Claire hadn't returned since she'd walked off. Whether she was in the galley fuming or on the phone with the captain again, no one knew. But the cabin had changed. It wasn't just one man standing anymore. It was the presence of truth that had settled across 30 rows, in every whispered conversation, every glance passed between strangers. Elijah sat back down without fanfare, returning to his seat like he'd simply read a passage from a book. He didn't ask for applause. He didn't look for approval. He just exhaled. The young man beside him finally stopped recording. But he didn't put the phone away. You sure you're a pastor? He asked quietly, smirking a little. Elijah chuckled. Some Sundays I wonder myself. The kid laughed, then looked down at his screen. That's already getting shared. People need to hear stuff like that. A few minutes passed. Then from 2 rows ahead, the woman in the blue blazer, The one Claire had said complained, slowly turned around. Her sunglasses were off now. She looked to be in her mid-50s, tight expression, but something about her had softened. I didn't say anything, she said flatly. Elijah raised his eyebrows. Ma'am, I never told her I was offended. I didn't complain about your necklace. The air grew still again. Several passengers who'd been listening perked up. She just asked if I was comfortable, the woman added, and I said I didn't notice anything. You're saying Claire lied? Someone muttered behind Elijah. The woman in the blazer didn't respond. She just turned back around, suddenly looking a little less sure of herself. Jonas reappeared from the front of the plane. His shirt was slightly wrinkled now, like he'd been wringing his hands. He stopped by Elijah's row and crouched slightly, voice lowered. The captain's aware, he said, and just for the record, you're not in any trouble. We're not removing you. There's no write-up. Nothing. Elijah nodded. Thank you for letting me know. I wish it had gone differently, Jonas added. Sometimes people bring their own baggage on board, and it's not in a suitcase. Elijah smiled faintly. That's true in more places than airplanes. Then Jonas hesitated. Look, I don't know if this is crossing a line, but would you mind if I came to your church sometime? I used to go when I was younger, but I haven't been in a long while. Elijah's smile deepened. Anytime. I'll save you a seat. Jonas patted the armrest gently before walking off. As he disappeared back up the aisle, a woman across from Elijah leaned over. Pastor, she whispered. Thank you. He looked at her, older, maybe in her 70s. She wore a long green scarf and held her hands in her lap like they were hiding something fragile. You didn't have to speak up, she said. But you did. Sometimes silence can feel heavier than a voice, Elijah answered. She smiled, eyes glossy. That's exactly it. The boy next to Elijah elbowed him lightly. You're going to be all over the internet, you know. Elijah looked out the window. Let's just hope I'm preaching the same on Sunday as I'm living right now. From behind, the curly-haired woman from earlier spoke up. I think the Lord already gave you your sermon, Pastor, she said. You just preached it at 35,000 feet. Laughter spread, low, genuine, needed. People began talking again, not just whispering. There was energy now, relief, almost like the cabin had collectively released something it didn't know it was holding. But still, Claire hadn't returned. When she finally did, she wouldn't come back alone, and she wouldn't expect what she'd find waiting for her. It had been almost 40 minutes since Claire had vanished. People assumed she'd stay gone until landing. But just as the seatbelt sign flicked on again, she reappeared, this time with the captain himself walking behind her. Captain Raymond Stills was in his mid-60s. Gray hair buzzed close, weathered skin from years in cockpits. He didn't look angry. He didn't look rushed. But there was something in his face, an alert stillness, like someone who had seen far worse and didn't want to make a situation worse than it already was. He stopped beside Elijah's row and crouched slightly, just as Jonas had. Sir, he said in a low, calm voice. My name's Ray. I understand there's been some tension on board. I'd like to hear directly from you what happened. Elijah looked him in the eye. Captain, I've been sitting here quietly. This cross around my neck seemed to be a problem for a flight attendant. She asked me to hide it. I said no. That's all. Ray glanced at the necklace, then at Elijah's calm posture. I appreciate your tone, the captain said. That matters more than you might think these days. Claire stood stiffly behind him, arms crossed. Passengers nearby were pretending not to listen, but no one had headphones on anymore. Everyone was tuned in. I've spoken with my crew, Ray continued, and I've watched the footage. Multiple passengers recorded parts of the interaction, including the young man next to you. Elijah gave a slight glance toward the teen, who gave a half nod, still holding his phone like it was a shield. Ray stood up and looked around at the surrounding rows. I want to be clear, he said louder now. There is no policy on this airline that prohibits religious symbols. Whether it's a cross, a hijab, a yarmulke, or anything else, passengers are free to express their beliefs as long as they are respectful. And from everything I've seen, Pastor Rowe has been nothing but that. Several people nodded. A few clapped, quiet, polite, not dramatic. Ray turned to Claire. We're going to have a longer conversation when we land. Claire didn't respond. Her face remained unreadable, but her jaw was tight. Still, she turned and walked back toward the galley without another word. Ray leaned back toward Elijah. You're not in trouble. You never were. I apologize on behalf of the crew. You don't have to, Elijah replied. But I appreciate it. Ray offered a small smile. Well, some things are still worth saying. And with that, he returned to the cockpit. Jonas reappeared moments later and quietly offered Elijah a free drink and snack box. Captain's orders, he said sheepishly. Said you deserved at least that. Elijah chuckled. I'll take the almonds. As the plane began its descent into Kansas City, something different settled over the cabin. People were chatting again, not nervously, but openly. Two men who hadn't spoken the whole flight were now exchanging church stories. A young woman pulled out her Bible and started highlighting verses. A toddler across the aisle waved at Elijah, and his mother mouthed, "Thank you." And Elijah, he just sat back and finished his sermon note. Forgiveness, he wrote, but not silence. Across the aisle, the older woman in green took out a pen and scribbled something on a napkin. She passed it across to Elijah. He unfolded it. It read, "You reminded us how to carry grace. Thank you." He folded it and slipped it into his notebook. The plane began its final descent, but there was a quiet sense of closure, like something had broken and then repaired itself, if only a little. But what Elijah didn't know was that the moment wasn't over. The world outside that plane was already paying attention. Flight 287 touched down in Kansas City just after 4:20 p.m., tires thumping softly against the runway. The usual ding sounded. People unbuckled. Overhead bins clicked open. But there was a strange quiet to the movement, like no one wanted to be the first to break what had just happened in the air. As the plane taxied toward the gate, a flight attendant, not Claire, came over the intercom. Her voice was nervous, almost shaky. We'd like to thank you for flying with us today. For those continuing on to Albuquerque, we'll begin boarding again shortly after a short break. Elijah waited. He always let others off first. He sat with his hands folded over his notebook, his cross still visible as the aisle cleared. When he finally stood to retrieve his bag, Jonas met him at the front of the plane. "Sir," he said, "there are 2 airport officers just outside the jet bridge. They're not here for you, they just want to speak briefly with the crew and take a statement." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Is someone pressing charges?" "No." But once the footage started spreading, someone tagged airport security. Then a few others. "I guess people are watching." Elijah stepped off the plane and into the fluorescent-lit walkway. 2 officers stood to the side, but neither approached him. They spoke quietly with a woman holding a clipboard, likely a gate supervisor. Jonas gave him a nod and disappeared back onto the aircraft. In the terminal, Elijah Fowle found a quiet seat by the window. He took out his phone for the first time in hours. 30 new messages, missed calls, a voicemail from his assistant back at the church. But what stood out was the alert at the top of the screen. A video had gone viral. It was the recording from the teen in 22B, now posted on TikTok, Twitter, and YouTube. The caption read, "Flight attendant tries to humiliate pastor for wearing cross. Watch what he does next." Over 800,000 views, and rising. Elijah watched only a few seconds. The video showed him sitting calmly, Claire towering over him, her voice sharp. His reply, quiet and grounded. Then it cut to his impromptu speech, the cross between his fingers. He turned the phone face down. He didn't like attention. Never had. He wasn't a man drawn to headlines or clicks, but something deeper stirred in him. Not pride. Not fear. Just the gravity of being seen. Minutes later, the teenager from 22B appeared in front of him. "Hey," the boy said, a little out of breath. "I'm getting off here. My layover's in KC. I just wanted to say thanks again for not flipping out." Elijah smiled. "You did more than I did. You told the truth." The kid laughed. "Nah, man. You lived it. I just hit record." He held out his hand. "I'm Tyrell, by the way." "Elijah." They shook. The boy walked away, phone still in hand, a little straighter now. Elijah sat back, rubbed his eyes. The weight of the day was starting to settle in his bones. Just then, his phone buzzed again, a message from his assistant. "The church board saw the video. They want you to address it Sunday. Everyone's talking about it." He leaned his head against the terminal window. Outside, another plane was taking off. The engines roared. The sun had dipped just low enough to catch the wings in gold. This wasn't what he planned. He came for peace, and ended up in a storm. But maybe storms weren't always meant to be avoided. Because sometimes the real sermon starts long before the pulpit, and echoes long after the plane lands. Sunday morning came faster than Elijah expected. He stood behind the pulpit at Grace Fellowship in Durham, the same place he'd preached nearly every week for the past 18 years. But this time, the air was different. Rows were packed tighter. Faces he didn't recognize filled the pews, some from other churches, some probably not from any at all. Phones were already recording before he even spoke. He didn't open with scripture. Not this time. He stepped forward, placed his notes aside, and looked out at the crowd. "Most of you saw the video," he began. "Some of you shared it. Others called. Some were angry. Some asked me why I didn't shout. Why I didn't call her out. Why I didn't fight back." He paused, letting the weight of the room settle. "I've thought about that too. I've been thinking about it every day since." There was no microphone feedback. No coughs. Just stillness. "I sat quietly on that plane, not because I'm weak or afraid, but because I've lived long enough to know that the loudest voice isn't always the strongest. Sometimes strength is sitting still when everything in you wants to stand up. Sometimes it's saying no with grace instead of with rage." Heads nodded across the sanctuary. "I didn't wear that cross to provoke anyone. I wore it because it reminds me of who I am. And when someone tells you to hide the very thing that shaped you, you've got two choices: erase yourself to make others comfortable, or stand still and let the discomfort belong to someone else." He looked out across the front row. Tyrell sat there next to Elijah's assistant. He gave a small smile. "What happened on that flight, it wasn't just about me. It was about all of us. About how often we're told to shrink down, tone it down, hold it in. Make it easier for everyone else. But the truth is, your faith, your story, your heritage, it's not a burden. It's not an apology. It's not optional." He reached for the small wooden cross around his neck and held it up gently. "My grandmother gave me this. Not because it was pretty, but because it was permanent. She told me, they'll try to take your voice. Don't hand them your silence too." A low murmur ran through the crowd: grief, pride, recognition. He took a deep breath. "I don't hate the woman from the plane. I'm not angry. But I hope she saw something that day that challenged her. And I hope we all remember, just because the world can't carry your truth doesn't mean you need to hide it." He stepped back. The congregation stood without prompting. It wasn't applause. It wasn't noise. Just people rising as one, like they understood something deeper than words. After service, Elijah stepped out into the spring air. People approached, shook his hand, hugged him, handed him cards. Some were crying. One woman simply placed her palm against his shoulder and whispered, "You gave me permission to stop hiding." By that evening, the video had passed 3.2 million views. News outlets were reaching out. Interviews were requested. Editorials were written. But Elijah kept his focus local. His inbox stayed full. But his hands stayed busy, visiting a family in the hospital, organizing food for the shelter, and finishing the next week's sermon. The cross never left his neck. And for every story that came in, about someone standing up, speaking out, or simply choosing not to shrink, he'd whisper a quiet prayer. Not for praise, but for courage. The kind that doesn't roar, just the kind that stays. Because real change doesn't always start with a protest or a headline. It starts with one person refusing to disappear. And if this story moved you, don't just scroll past it. Share it, speak about it, and remember to stand firm in who you are, even when it's easier not to.